I want to share some thoughts this morning from 1 Corinthians 10, and I really want to call what I want to share with you in these next few minutes running well, or it could be another title, which is how to avoid ending up in a mess. I quite like both titles. When you become a Christian, it does not always mean that you become nice. This is a surprise to some of us because it takes a while to develop your Christian life, particularly if you come from a place like Corinth. Corinth had a reputation in the ancient world for being unruly, hard-living, sexually immoral. And when these Corinthians became Christians, it was a huge job to disciple them, help them on the journey, teaching them what they needed to know. And Paul spent 18 months engaging with them, and then he left. After he left, things began to fall apart. Their worship had collapsed into some sort of selfish grabbing around the supernatural. There were factions that were developed. Their morals headed south. They found themselves with quarreling and jealousy and spreading poison throughout their church. So how were they going to get out of this mess in which they were living? How are they going to learn how to run well? Well, Paul points to 4 things that I want to bring to our attention this morning. And the first one is this, that if you're going to get out of the mess or run well, it will be because you learn how to train your memory. Paul reminds the Corinthians that there was one nation of people that had gone through this journey before, and that was the nation of Israel. They were called out of Egypt in this remarkable way. God brought them through water. God brought them through pressure. He brought them through trial. And you read that in the book of Exodus and in Nehemiah 9 and Psalm 106. God set them free. But once they've been set free, it's as though they surrender their memory, that they hand their memory over to some other force. And they find themselves practicing, choosing God forgetfulness. And they do this quite deliberately. They do this without recognizing the cost as to what this would be, but that's what they do. In short, they choose evil and fail to remember God. So Israel found themselves in a place where they were having to live with the consequences of not training their memory. Often God gives you what you want. He gives you what you remember to ask him for. Paul warns the Galatians, do not be deceived, God is not mocked. Persons sow what they reap. And the reality was then, and is still there now, that we can forget God. And in forgetting him, we lose our way. We don't remember who he is. We don't remember who we are. We start to stumble and we find ourselves in a mess. The second thing that Paul exhorts them in is that they need to be able to avoid idolatry, swerve idolatry. Now, what's an idol? An idol is anything that takes the place of God. Israel built their idols when they became impatient and rebellious towards God. When they found themselves frustrated with God for some reason or other, couldn't cope with the frustration, couldn't cope with their sense of God doing something on their behalf. And so they chose to worship idols. And Paul says that's what they did. And if God's not at the center, that's what we do too. We create our idols. We start to build them, and they get in the way of our spiritual development. So we build our wealth idol. And if you have got a wealth idol, it's time to knock it down. or we build a power idol. And if you've got one of those, you need to smash it to the ground. Or we build a pleasure idol. And if you've got one of those, I suggest you set it alight as soon as you can after this talk. And we build our idols, and they control us and shape us, and they make sure we end up living our lives in a mess, or we find ourselves unable to run in the Christian life that God's put in front of us. So Paul's saying to the Corinthians, train your memory, avoid idols if you're going to live well. And the third thing he says is guard your body. The people of Israel were shaped by what they did with their bodies. And we are all shaped by what we do with our bodies. Paul warns the Corinthians that the same is for them. And the cost of abusing your body, particularly through sexual immorality, can be exceptionally high. And Israel tested God in this area. They tested his rules. They tested the walls around them that God had put in front of them to protect them. And they found themselves being tested and ultimately in a place of disaster because of what they did with their body. So Paul's saying to the Corinthians, guard your body, look after it. You live your life through your body, so you need to give it the best chance you can to serve you in a way that will enable you to run well and enable you to keep out of a mess. And I want to suggest a question that may help us this week in how we deal with this. What about this question? In the last few months, what are the things you do doing to you? What are the things you do with your body doing to you? Can you notice what your work is doing to you? Can you notice what you eat is doing to you? Can you notice what you find pleasure in doing to you? Can you notice what your sex life is doing to you? Can you come up with the realization as to what Netflix is doing to you and how you're guarding your body? So, Paul's saying, train your memory, avoid idolatry, guard your body, and then the final thing he says is speak life. Speak life. Many in Israel grumbled, and in grumbling, they created the world in which they chose to live. Now, this was not lament. Lament's a positive thing, where you take what you've been through and you bring it to God and lay it before him and ask him for help. But they weren't doing that. They were focused on grumbling, which is a different thing altogether. The Australians have a joke about the English, and the joke goes this way: how do you know British Airways has landed at Sydney Airport? The answer is because when the engine switched off, you can still hear them whining. It's a good joke because it's got an element of truth in it. And what you speak shapes you, shapes your world. The world of Israel and the world of the Corinthians was shaped by what they spoke. Their words created the framework in which they lived their lives. And it's exactly the same with us. The words you speak will shape you. If you grumble, you will get into a mess. If you grumble, you will be hampered on the run that God's called us into. If you are able to speak life, then that starts to transform the framework in which you live. I spent some time with a vicar, Anglican vicar, not too long ago, and I asked him, what is your inner name, the name inside your heart? I knew his name was Matthew, which actually wasn't his real name, but that's the name I'm giving to you. And Matthew said, you know, my real name is I will never amount to much. I will never amount to much. And he picked this name up from his father, who had told him that. And even though he was very successful as a vicar by any indices, he was in this world of I will never amount to much. And so he had to go on a journey of speaking life to himself. And he came up after a few months of that journey, and I asked him, how's the journey going? And he said, well, I found a new name. I'm speaking new life. And I said, well, what's the new name? He said, the new name is, where God speaks to me, you're my favorite. You're my favorite. And he said, I repeat that name. And that has transformed his life, transformed the way in which he responds to the world in which he lives. So we create much of our world out of our words. And can I suggest some help here that may help in being able to get out of a grumbling place into a world of freedom and liberty? A great question that I often ask myself if I'm in a difficult spot or if I'm tempted to grumble. And I ask myself this question: where is the resurrection of Jesus Christ present in this situation? And there can't be anything more positive than the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So when you're tempted to grumble, where is the resurrection of Jesus Christ present in this situation? So these are 4 things that Paul exhorts the Corinthians to live in, that they've to learn from Israel. And we've got Israel and we've got the Corinthians all teaching us as to how we are to live. Now, where is God in this finally? Well, it's clear that God's in the middle of the mess. He was in the mess with Israel. He was in the mess with the Corinthians. And he's with us in the mess we're in right now. He says at the end of 1 Corinthians 10, Paul says, when you're tempted, he will also provide a way out so that you can stand underneath it. To put it a bit more poetically, I love Psalm 124 verse 7, which says this: we have escaped like a bird from the fowler's snare, and the snare has been broken, and we have escaped. Let me repeat that. We have escaped like a bird out of the fowler's snare. The snare has been broken, and we have escaped. So, train your memory, avoid idolatry, guard your body, speak life, and then we have escaped like a bird out of the fowler's snare. The snare has been broken, and we have escaped. Amen.